11th, 2004. And we're at, what is it, 46 Madison Circle, Greenfield, the home of Phyllis Nahman. And I'd like to have you start by talking about where you grew up and your family and how they got here and those kinds of things.
Okay, and redirect me if I'm going off in a weird direction.
Don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, I was born in Turners Falls, the Farron Memorial Hospital, which is now the Farron Long-Term Care Center, in Montague City on October 14th, 1942, the third of 4 children of Ethel and Meyer Rubin. My dad's family came from Russia in the early part of this century, settled in Worcester, and then my dad's father had to come to the country because of his health and where there was fresh air. So he came to Turners Falls because he had a sister who lived in Turners Falls, Mary Baker. And my dad and his parents settled up near what is now up near the airport. It was pretty much wilderness when they came. And his father was a peddler. Well, they had been peasants, his parents, in Russia. His father was in the Tsar's army, a flute player. But my grandfather started a peddling business in Turners Falls, and my dad went to Turner's public schools until he was in the 8th grade and had to leave to help support the family because his father's health was not great. My dad had 2 sisters. His family spoke mostly Yiddish, so I certainly learned Yiddish from them and my folks when I was growing up, although I can't speak it, I can understand it. And my dad started his business career with a horse and buggy, going out and collecting rags and paper from people in the area, and had a very rich and interesting history. And if you're ever interested in those stories, I have lots of tapes you can have to hear those stories. As time went on, my dad expanded his business, and as a young man, he built a little gas station and was selling used cars. When he met my mom, who was born in Springfield, of a family that had immigrated from Austria-Hungary, my mom married him and came to live in Turners Falls. And what my dad did was clean out the gas station, add on some rooms, and that became their house. And every year that they had a child, my father added on another room. And that was the house I grew up in, which is still there. It's been kind of subdivided into, I think it's 3 apartments at this point. It was not such a big house, they're little apartments. But my dad then branched out into various other businesses. And as I was growing up, when I was a little girl, my dad had a farm, and he was in the junk business with his father. By that time, the peddling had changed to going out to the area industries and collecting their scrap metal, and Dad had become a junk dealer in metal. And I was born during World War II, and my dad tried actually to volunteer for the service, thinking that was his duty as a citizen, but he was told that he could do better, he could do more for the country by gathering all this metal and then selling it to the folks that recycled it and made, I think, munitions out of it, I don't know. So Dad stayed in business and stayed to take care of his family, his sister's family that needed a bit of help and lived next door, and on one side, and his mother and one of his other sisters, who also needed some help and lived on the other side of us. So we were surrounded by family, and there weren't a lot of other houses up there at that time. My best friend growing up was my cousin who lived next door,
What road was this on?
This is on Millers Falls Road. And my brother still has a garage there, Benny Rubin. So we've been in that same area for a long time. When I was the only kid in the family who decided to go to college, although my parents wanted us all to do that. There were 4 of us. My other siblings went into business, and 2 with my father, and my sister got married and went into business with her husband. But I went off to UMass in a kind of a different world, and that's a whole other story about having one foot in each world, the junk business in Turner's Falls and one at UMass in the wider universe. But it was after that, while I was in college, I married Archie Nahman from South Africa, whom I had met in Israel, and we moved to Greenfield. But we've always been in this area, so our family's been here for a long time.
Couple things, just sort of follow-up things. When your dad was collecting the paper and rags and stuff, you said within the area, what like how far did he range from Turner's Falls?
All the surrounding towns. I mean, he used to go to, certainly he went as far as Leverett and Amherst in that direction. He would go up as far as Brattleboro to the north. He had a pretty wide circle, actually, and he started doing that with a horse and buggy. And we have some very funny family stories about horse and buggy trips, and eventually, of course, got a truck, and then ended up with a whole bunch of trucks and with people working for him, going to the various. When he was taking metal out of the industries around, he stayed pretty much in the area because he got enough business from them. He used to take things out of all the paper mills around, and the tool companies, and made it very good business doing that. He did something really interesting. He started with no money. They were quite literally dirt poor. I mean, incredibly poor. He dropped out of school because they didn't have enough to eat. And my dad was really smart. He when he needed something and he didn't have it and couldn't possibly buy it, like a big metal shear, those huge things, he went and looked at other people's and saw how they were built and how they worked.
Do you need to get that?
No.
Oh.
And but let me just. Oh, Archie's got it. I was going to turn it down. He built it himself. He was really amazing. He said he used to go to the engineers at places like Millers Falls Tool and the various other places, people he'd become friendly with, and said, can you tell me how this works, or how I could connect that, or where I could get whatever. And he built his own. He made a wrecker. I still remember that truck, and someplace have pictures of it with a big, huge boom. And he used part of it for hauling in cars because he always had a little side business with used cars. But he also had extensions and things so that he could use it for pulling big machines and things. But he built it all himself. And it's astounding when I think about it, what he did. He took down some of the bridges, in this I wasn't around for this, but I know about it. After the big flood in, was it 36 or 38? Yeah. He took down he took down the metal parts of some of those bridges, and when we would go for a ride as kids, he would point out, this is where I took down this bridge, and he would tell us stories about it, of himself and another man or 2 other men doing whatever they did, and it's amazing. I thought it was quite amazing that he knew how to do that, but he knew how to look for people who could give him information, and they were really helpful. So he made a living doing that, and we grew up in the midst of this business.
It sounds like he built pretty good relationships in that way with neighbors and
Yep.
other people in that business.
He did, and his family had really good relationships with other people in the area, many of whom, there were some people of French descent, there were the French Catholics in our area, there were the Polish Catholics, lots of Polish people. I'm trying to think of who else we were particularly close to. There are a lot of families that today we're still connected to those families. I still see those people. They still remember who I am because I'm related to. They know my brothers from their businesses and my dad from his business. I haven't seen anybody for a while that remembered my grandfather. They might all be pretty much gone, but have been a couple around fairly recently. And I know my dad said that his family would never have survived had it not been for especially some of the Polish people in the area, which is interesting to me because as an adult, I've done a lot of reading about the Holocaust and what happened in Poland, and it makes it very clear that you can't be painting with a broad brush, because while we hear stories about horrible things about some people in some of the Polish towns that outdid the Nazis in doing what they were doing to destroy the Jews, there were also wonderful Polish people. My dad told a story about a woman in the patch who they were all working people, and they were all frugal people. And this woman saved her family's money. She was in charge of the money. My dad described her as a woman with big breasts. He didn't use that word. Big breast, long dress. He said they used to sweep the floor with their dresses, and cotton stockings that the women wore garters and twisted around. And that woman stored money between her breasts, inside her bosom there, and in the knot of her stockings. I saw some of this myself in slightly later years, but my dad said when his family didn't have enough money for food, or they needed to make a payment on the horse or the wagon or something, my grandfather would send my father as a little boy down to the patch to one woman in particular, and tell him to borrow $10 or something, which at that point was a lot of money. And my dad remembers as a little boy being amazed to see this woman reach into her blouse and from between her breasts pull out this roll of bills. Well, they might have been dollar bills, I don't know, and peel them off and say to him, and he could say it with an approximation of the Polish accent, "You sure that's enough, sonny? You father, he need more? Maybe $20?" And my dad said no. He was told to get just 10 or whatever amount. But he said sometimes, and they did this back and forth. They would return the money, repay the money, and occasionally they'd have to borrow again. And he said she hauled up her skirt one time and unrolled her garter, and there was some more money. So he said if it weren't for those people, he would never have survived. And he taught all of us from a really early age, using stories such as that, nobody can get along without everybody else. And even though there may be some ways in which people disagreed, it was some of these same people or their children in different ways who the Catholic kids would spit in front of the synagogue when they walked there, and the Jewish kids would cross the street but spit over toward the church. Those kind of things went on, but at the same time, in a very homey kind of way, on a different level, in a different way, human being to human being, they helped each other out a lot. I walked with my grandmother to some of these houses to deliver, pots of soup when somebody was sick. Mm-hmm. We used to walk down toward where the Greeks it used to be called the Greeks Restaurant down on the road that goes to Montague. I don't know the name of the road. Near Randall Road, yeah. Yeah. There used to be a Polish person that lived there. It was a good friend of my grandmother's. I can't remember the name of the family. Might have been Sasma. I don't remember, but they were friends, and they used to cook things and carry them back and forth, and they took care of each other when they were sick. The women, would go and help with each other's kids and stuff. So there was an incredible level of cooperation there, which was really very nice.
I imagine that neighbors probably relied on him in this, on your family in the same way.
Yeah, they helped each other out a lot. And it was a matter of they're the only people there. You get along with whoever you need to get along with. And they got to be good friends. As I said, generations later, Our families are still connected. Those people used to come to my dad's junkyard when he sold used cars. They all bought their cars there. They still tell stories about it. Their kids and their grandchildren tell stories because they've been handed down in their families too. And then we had an appliance business, appliance and furniture, because my dad wanted to have a clean business for his kids. They shouldn't have to work as hard as he did. And we all worked in these various businesses. And those people came and bought furniture and appliances. And my brothers delivered it. And when I was 16 and got my license, this happened to all of us, our rite of passage. We all had to go out on Friday nights and Saturday mornings to do the collections because most people couldn't pay for anything outright. And my dad used to finance it. He said they were honest people. He asked them how much they could pay, and we used to go pick up their $5 a week or their $10 a week. And they would always have, not always, but often have, cookies and milk or something else. It was a whole social thing as well as, and it worked very well. And people still, at this stage of my life, are telling me stories about, I remember when I was a little kid. So it's kind of fun. It was a nice, it was a close-knit community in that way.
A couple other things as follow-up. From your grandfather, or on the other hand, on your mother's side of the family, did you hear bits and pieces about either Russia or the Austria-Hungary areas that they had come from?
My grandmother,
did you grow up hearing about those places?
Not much, Michael. My grandmother, who lived next door, had stories to tell, but she wanted to start with the voyage over. In cattle class, down in the very bottom of the boat, everybody really rammed together down in the hold of the boat. She was sick the whole way, and she told stories about that. I used to listen for a long time because I found them fascinating. And oh my God, how I wish I had asked a lot more questions. She didn't want to talk about Russia. My grandfather never talked about it, and my grandmother didn't want to talk about it. She said those were not good times, and I don't want to talk about it. They were times of pogroms. She did tell us that the Jewish boys used to be conscripted into the Russian army, and you never saw most of them again. My grandfather was very lucky that he knew how to play the flute, and I don't know anything about the background of that, but he got to play the flute, and he was very lucky. They did tell us stories about relatives who maimed themselves so they could get out of military service. I do remember an uncle who lived in Worcester who walked with a dreadful limp, and you could see the pain in his face. He was always in pain, and his family did that to him purposely to keep him out of the army. So it was not, they didn't leave because it was going to be a pleasure to leave. They left because things were terrible for them, and they would not talk about any more than that. My grandmother did talk about leaving her parents, especially her mother, and how sad it was. And I still have a tape of a song that she sang. It's a kind of lullaby for the children, but it's a very sad song, sung in Yiddish about leaving and going to the Golden Land, and when will I ever see my mother again? And that was a really very sad thing. But beyond that, she didn't say anything. They talked about some of their relatives. Some of them had been. Her father's father had been a Torah scholar, and we have a picture of him, and that. But that's it. And from the Austrian-Hungarian side, they never wanted to talk about much either. My grandmother, who lived in Springfield, what she passed down about her heritage was that she was a magnificent pastry baker. And she said that her mother was. And when times were good in Budapest, she said, these were the wonderful things they did. And but they didn't talk about anything else. And my mom's dad died before I was born. But my brothers who were here before me never learned anything about the old country from them. And my mother said that her father sent money to one of his sisters for much of the time they were growing up to help support her. And my mom's own family was poor, but they always sent some money to the sister. My mom couldn't remember if it was one or two sisters, and they disappeared during the Holocaust. And we think the whole family thinks, from all the little information we could find out, that they went to Theresienstadt, outside of Prague, which is where people from Budapest and Austria-Hungary often were sent. And we think that they died in the Holocaust. Certainly there was no connection with them afterward, and we think that's what happened. So we don't know a lot. You know, my mom always wanted to go back to Budapest and see if she could find anything, but she never did. So.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what she would have found.
You know, or what she would have looked for.
Yeah.
You know, we know my her mother's maiden name, but you know, it could have been a really big family. I don't know. We might be able to do some research on that. I was interested in doing some with her, but along the way, my dad started to get a little ill, and my mother didn't want to travel anymore. And then my mom got Alzheimer's, and she doesn't remember anything. So.
No, on a I guess a more cheerful note, you mentioned that at one point, I think this is when you were born, your dad had a little farm.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. My dad always was very ambitious. He wanted to do all kinds of things. I think the fact that all of his children are interested in everything comes from him, because he wanted to try everything, and he thought he would become a farmer. When I was a little girl, he had cattle, and we had a big garden. And what I remember is the tail end of this venture, because my dad actually, he who had quit school in the 8th grade actually went to UMass, which was Mass Agricultural College at the time, Mass Aggie, and took a couple courses in, I don't know, cattle, something to do with the milk. And we drank the milk from his cows, and he used to, I don't know if he used to sell it. I think he probably sold some of it. And I remember being in the barn and, you know, doing the rounds with him and taking care of the cows and milking the cows and all that, being told to stay well out of the way of the hind legs there. And I remember the last calf that was born in our barn was going to be, quote, my calf. And then eventually Dad just sold them because it was taking too much time, and he really needed to be supporting his family with the junk business, which was growing when I was a little kid. That was during the war. So eventually got rid of it. But I know that other neighbors in the area got milk from him. Whether he gave it to them or sold it, I don't know. And I remember that the person who was the pediatrician for all 4 of us children in my parents' family, and then for my children, when I had children later on, Merritt Lowe, Dr. Lowe, was a really good friend of my dad's, and he used to go and sit in the barn with him. And my dad was very proud of the fact that Dr. Lowe had said that his milk was such good, clean, healthy milk for children, and, you know, used to recommend it and all that. And they were friends for both of their lives. And I remember from the farm part of it, my dad did keep some fields of strawberries and rhubarb, and my mom used to can all the fruits and vegetables. I mean, we ate that stuff. was very important in our lives. But when we were kids, we all got as a job to help take care of the strawberry field, which was really pretty extensive, and pick them. And we had a little table that my dad would set up near the roadside to sell some to passers-by, little stand, which was kind of fun to do. First, he made sure that we knew how to do arithmetic, and then we all got a turn sitting out there selling things. Oh, and asparagus. And my brothers got to drive the tractor. He had some kind of tractor that he drove up and down the aisles, and the girls got to do the down on the ground weeding and picking and that sort of stuff. And at the time, I remember that I didn't enjoy it all that much, but in retrospect, it was kind of fun.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about such as it was, assuming the numbers were small, the sense of Jewish community in that place? I assume there were at least a handful of other families. What was that?
Yeah, there was a little Jewish community. In fact, there was a synagogue on. Oh my goodness! I think it's. Is it K Street? I can't remember. It's right up next to Our Lady of Czestochowa. Mm-hmm. A little wooden building that used to be a Baptist church. And Baptist? Lutheran. I think it was Baptist. I'm not sure. Maybe it was Lutheran. The Baptist was in Greenfield. The synagogue in Greenfield was built on a Baptist church. In any case, it was a church. And it was a small, wonderful building that in my memory still smells of the women baking downstairs in the little tiny hall, baking honey cake and teglach for Rosh Hashanah, for New Year's. And there were just 10 families, and just enough to make a minyan. And the synagogue building was quite beautiful. It had all that beaded, vertical beaded wood on the inside, and over time it got darker and darker. It was really beautiful. I have a picture somewhere of the beautiful ark that was there. Simple but really lovely, and it was just the right size for our community. There were these 10 families. Everybody knew that when it was the holidays, everybody had to go to shul because they needed 10 men. It was only the men they counted then. And my grandfather, who lived next door to us, used to come over to our house, and he would bang on the door or bang on the kitchen window, because we spent a lot of our time in the kitchen, and he would yell to my father, "Meya, Meya, du kommst to shul!" And he would say what time it was in Yiddish, and they would walk to shul. They did not drive. The old folks, of course, were Orthodox. They had come from an Orthodox tradition in Europe, and they maintained that. And my parents kept a kosher home all the time. Most of the time I was growing up. I think by the time I got to junior high, they had decided that going to Springfield every week for me was a little tough. Mm-hmm. And by then, somewhere along the line, the trains that went through Greenfield and would bring kosher meat weren't running anymore. So they had to go to Springfield or to Worcester to get the meat every week. So that kind of went by the wayside. But all the Jews in town did that. And everybody knew everybody else. There was a nice feeling of community, but a lot of competition. For example, there were a couple of other guys that were in the junk business, just like my dad, and they were always one-upping each other. But on the weekend, they would get together to play cards in somebody's house, And I still remember some of those families, and everybody kind of looked out for everybody else to make sure that everybody was okay. But once again, each one was trying to get the business from these various places. They all managed. They all did well. There was not a full-time rabbi. Of course, they couldn't afford that. And whoever was doing well in their business on any given year would be the ones that paid for to hire a rabbi or a rabbinical student or some elderly rabbi who wasn't working full time anymore to come in for the high holidays.
And that would be the one time of the year that you'd have somebody from outside.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the one time of year we knew the synagogue would be open. Although they used to open on Simchas Torah and, excuse me, I'm trying to remember, I think maybe there were some things on Purim from time to time. But that was organized by the people in town, usually by the women who wanted to have events for their children to go to. We would march around the shul with paper Israeli flags, and sing and carry the Torahs around and all of that. But I have very fond memories of events at that synagogue. We used to walk downtown. We lived a little over a mile away. My mom used to push a baby carriage down for the high holidays, and tucked in the baby carriage, she used to have little little bags of food for the kids. And even on Yom Kippur, she would just say, on Yom Kippur you have to sit outside to eat it. You can't eat it in the shul, but children can do this. And it was a long walk going back up that hill, but it was a fun thing. And our neighbors got to know that in September the Jews would be walking down the street, and some of them would come out and visit along the way. There were instances of very good relationships with neighbors who were not Jewish, and some really not so nice things. That synagogue closed, and people joined the Greenfield Synagogue in about 1960. Maybe a couple years before that, it was kind of not in use, but it was just closed. I know I wanted to get married there, and in 1962, when I got married, that synagogue had been closed for such a long time. It was so musty and really dusty and all of that. We didn't have enough time to do it because we got married over just one summer. We decided on the spur of the moment, and that was it.
But until it did close, it was an Orthodox congregation.
Yeah. Yeah. The men sat in the front. The rabbis who came in read only Hebrew. They talked to each other in Yiddish, but the service was in Hebrew. It became interesting to me only when I went to Israel when I was 16 and learned a little Hebrew, and came back and studied Hebrew in Greenfield here, and I could follow along. Then it became really interesting. Before that, it was just sort of what went on in the background. It's interesting, the men sat in the front and were davening up there, or at least moving back and forth, and the women sat up in the back, dressed to a fare thee well, and it was the old get dressed to the teeth, and who was going to wear what kind of hat this year. The women sat up in the back, and since none of the women knew how to read Hebrew, they sat up in the back and talked. They visited, they gossiped, they talked about their children, and that's what happened. And the women would come and go, but the men, they had to stay because there had to be a minyan in there. Mm-hmm. And the kids, were up in the back with the women until they were old enough. When the boys got bar mitzvah, they sat in the front. But the girls, there was no such thing as bat mitzvah in that synagogue at that time. I don't know if there was anywhere around here. I don't think so. And so that's what went on in that shul. And yes, it was a pretty close-knit community. It was interesting that the children were sort of sparse. Like there was only one other kid who was exactly my age. No, he wasn't. He was a year older than me. And none of us really liked each other very much. You know how when you're in high school you got to date somebody from another high school because that's cool, and you don't want the same people that you know too much about and that know too much about you. And the Jewish kids weren't great friends. And there were so few, there was no choice. If you really didn't kind of like somebody, it was too bad. That's who there was.
It's interesting, just as a sort of a counterpoint to that. Now that my daughter Della has been going to the Hebrew school, she really enjoys those kids there, in large part because she doesn't see them in her daily school.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. The attraction is of the same origin, which is that you want to be with kids that you're ordinarily not around.
Yep.
That's different.
Yeah,
So.
it's the same with our grandchildren. They enjoy this set of religious school friends, for who they are,
Yeah.
and then their other friends are people from the neighborhood and kids they go to regular school with. So it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I don't know if I think that's not true. That was not true for my Christian friends, because they would go from school to their I don't remember, confirmation classes, I don't remember, CCD classes and other kinds of stuff at their religious schools after school during the week. And so they kind of hung out together at school and at religious school. They were a much bigger group, and they were pretty much the dominant kids, in the public school.
Now, did your participation or your family's participation in sort of a traditional Jewish life, did that carry over for all of your siblings, as the generations switched over? Or?
And that's a really interesting question, because this whole thing that business fascinates me, about where did this come from and where did it go. Yeah. I have two older brothers. My eldest brother, we all identify as Jewish, but my two brothers are not at all observant and not involved in Jewish communities at all. Interestingly enough, they remained, my eldest brother is maybe a tiny bit more involved than my next brother, the one just older than me. But they stayed involved, at least they retained membership in the Jewish community, and once in a while went to something. While their children were around, they were quite involved when their children were around. But and as long as my father was alive, out of respect for my dad and his beliefs, they went and they belonged while Dad was around. But I don't know if it had to do with the fact that it just seemed a little foreign to them as they were growing up. I don't know what they're. We should have this conversation sometime while they're around and I'm around. I'll try to remember that because it will be interesting for me. But they kind of withdrew. They did not have that same identification. Both of them started out marrying very young, marrying Jewish women, and both of them divorced. Both of them had marriages that became unhappy for their various reasons. Both of them divorced, and my eldest brother is now married to someone who is not Jewish and is very happy. And his children still belong to synagogues and are active. And his grandchildren have, the ones of the appropriate age, have been bar and bat mitzvahed and have been active, actually. My next brother down, his two boys were bar mitzvahed. His daughter was not bat mitzvahed, and he doesn't have much of a connection at all. Although they still identify themselves as Jewish. They don't belong to Jewish communities. I'm probably the most identified and have been the most active in remaining involved Jewishly, but certainly not in any orthodox way. I don't know what label would fit, but I almost think maybe Reconstructionist or progressive in some way, because I've gone a whole lot way further left than all of that. But there are some things about the tradition that I really respect and enjoy. of our children, our son, our eldest child, is married to a woman who's not Jewish and very happy, and he has 2 wonderful kids who are being raised as Jewish. They go to Jewish religious school, but their mom celebrates Christmas and Easter, and she remains identified with her church, which is Presbyterian. And so the kids know mom's holidays and dad's holidays, and our son was pretty religious most of his life. So it's interesting that they've chosen to go that way. For whatever reasons, that's what they chose to do. And it's working. The kids say they're the luckiest kids in the world. And when I asked them once why, they said, because we're Jewish and Christian. And I think they were thinking about Hanukkah and Christmas at the time they were really little. But I think they have worked out how to do all of that. And it's quite a wonder to behold. It makes us really pleased to see what they're doing. Our daughter, our younger child, remained much more Jewishly connected, and she keeps a kosher home because her husband wants to do that. It's not a super kosher home, but they buy kosher meat and stuff and that sort of thing. And they're very much involved in Jewish life. So it's interesting to see how that has come down over the generations. So I mean, who knows where it will go, but it's interesting to see the changes with the times and with the evolution of religious life and Jewish life in this country, and what the possibilities are. And there's been a lot of loosening up. We have moved, certainly in my lifetime, from the Turner's Falls Shul that was Orthodox and just everything there about it was Orthodox, to the Greenfield Synagogue, which now has an interfaith cemetery and welcomes interfaith families, and just sees the richness of that. So times have changed.
Yeah, I'm going to flip.
It has changed greatly over time. My parents would have, had my head on a platter had I married someone not Jewish, and which I considered at one point. And I know both my brothers considered it before they married Jewish women. They were both, at least one of them was, I think, very much in love with a woman who was not Jewish. And I have always felt that it was a big mistake for my parents to push my brothers into marriage with somebody who was Jewish, hoping it would work out, being sure it would work out, but it didn't. And I think you can't make somebody do something that doesn't feel right to them. But we had no choice. We were told we had no choice, and that's very different, I think, from the way we've brought up our own children, and from the way we've decided to conduct our lives since we became adults. And in a broader sense, not just on the level of family, but in a broader sense, it seems to me that except for people who are really ultra-Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, there is a more tolerant level of people as human beings and as equal human beings. That is, we don't have to hold ourselves different from everybody else. We have a lot of things in common as human beings. And I think that people, maybe I'm being, Pollyanna over here, but on many levels, some people at least have learned that if you set yourself off and are very different, you're also putting yourself up for negative things, And I don't know if putting yourself up for is the right language, because I think that's comes from internally and externally. But setting oneself apart does not seem to be the way we're going in most areas of Judaism, except for the real Orthodox. I just see that. The statistics and the intermarriage statistics and the lessening number of people who say they are Jewish, I guess, kind of shows that. But in a way, we're more accepted than we were before. My grandmother used to tell my father, if somebody's spitting at the show, when they walk past it, don't worry about it, but when they're not looking, you can walk by the church and spit at it. I mean, you wouldn't teach your kids that. I wouldn't teach my kids that. Of course not. And I remember going to church for the first time, a Catholic church in Turner, an invitation of a friend. My parents were not happy. I was in high school already. Mm-hmm. My parents were not happy, but they let me go, much to their credit. I may have told you this before, but I went to some kind of a midnight mass. I remember it was a very big deal to be doing this at night. And the priest was talking about the Jews killing Christ. And it was a small town. Everybody knew everybody else. And here was this Jew sitting up toward the front with her friend, not knowing whether I was supposed to kneel when they knelt or stand up, or not knowing what I was supposed to do, feeling very self-conscious and a little scared. And when I heard that, I was really scared. Yeah. But things have changed. We're not afraid to go to each other's houses of worship. In fact, people visit back and forth regularly. Mm-hmm. There's an interfaith council. There didn't used to be such a thing. There never would have been such a thing around here anyway. So I think that maybe tolerance is a word, maybe it's not. Maybe it's just understanding of better understanding of humanity and human relationships has changed over time.
Yeah. Now, I guess related to that, I know, in your youth you did some travel, and that's how you met Archie in Israel, mm-hmm. right? Was that because your parents were, in the same way that they were pressuring your brothers, they wanted you to find a Jewish mate? There was something like that, right?
Yep.
So you've been,
yep.
And you can either tell that story or not, but the point is you've traveled a lot, but then you ended up coming back mm-hmm. here. And I guess what I'm particularly curious about is what feels so, why does it feel right to be living in the same, more or less the same community in which you grew up?
Do you mean
yeah?
You mean Jewish community,
yeah.
Or just generally?
Just generally, having seen so many other places, you've come back here.
I love it here. I feel at home here. I think this is a very beautiful place. The world is full of beautiful places, but this is a very beautiful place. And I feel really lucky in that I grew up in the family that I did and got to know so many people in the area. And my parents always really respected other people and what they did. And, of course, we learned to respect other people and what they did. How hard they were working, what kinds of things they were doing. I wanted to be back in this place where I like knowing people in the area. Most of the time, except when I'm in a hurry, I like going to the grocery store downtown and having people know who I am. I feel rooted here. I really feel very rooted here. I like knowing the generation before me and the one before them. I mean, I knew the grandparents of some of these people. I can walk through the Jewish cemetery, for example, or for that matter, any of the others, and I know a lot of the names, and I know a lot of those people, and I know their children, and I know some of their grandchildren, and at this point, just before I retired, some of their great-grandchildren, were students of mine at GCC. And so, I just feel like I have an understanding of the people in the area, and I feel very, very much at home in this small town area. That doesn't mean that we don't love to go out and go other places. We love to travel, and certainly have thought of living other places in the world. But we joke about, even Arch, who was born on Rhodes Island off Italy and Greece and lived most of his life in South Africa. We joke about having maple syrup in our veins instead of blood because we just feel so very comfortably rooted here. This is kind of where I was planted and didn't want to leave. And both in the broader community, certainly we're very comfortable in the broader community around here, and in the Jewish community. And one thing about the Jewish community, we often have our differences with the local community, and a number of times we thought of doing something different. You know, at one time we were going to belong to a chavra, and another time we were thinking about just going to a different community. But we thought, you know what? This is home. This is our community, and if there's something we don't like about it, we need to be a part of it and try to make some changes from within, or learn to live with things that a lot of other people want and we don't. So it's where we want to stay.
Can I ask one last?
You can ask anything you want.
Okay.
Sure.
How, because you grew up here, I mean, there must be myriad ways in which the Jewish community itself has evolved as you've lived here. I mean, what have been some of the transformations? I guess not just in terms of tradition or practice, but even just the demographics, the composition of the community.
It's changed a lot. The Jewish community in Turners was made up of people like my dad and my mom, people who were first-generation American Jews, and none, for the most part, there was one exception that I can recall, but for the most part, they were working people who went only through junior high school. Maybe some of them, a couple of them got through high school, but they all worked from the bottom on up. They wanted something different for their children, and most of them made the opportunity for their children to go to college. And so the next generation was different. It has changed a great deal. There are now a lot more people working in various professions. There are people in the Jewish community who have come in. Lots of people in Greenfield, for example, it used to be everybody who'd been here for at least a generation. Most people are not from here. Most of the people in the community came from someplace else. That's very different. Most of them brought with them the different traditions. Some of them came from various cities, and they brought different traditions with them, which kind of opened up the community a bit. So the demographics are really different. There was a time, I can't remember when, maybe it's more than 25 years ago, it was maybe 30-something years ago, it looked like this Jewish community was kind of on its last leg. There were a lot of old people, very few younger people, very few. And in Archie's in my generation, I mean, just the decade that we are, there were, a handful of people. And we thought, that maybe this is going to be the end of it here. Maybe we're going to have to join with somebody else. And a whole new wave of people came in with little kids, and they rejuvenated the place. And it once again brought new ideas. So, there were cycles, and it changes. And people do their best to respect what came before them, but they're really clear about what doesn't work for them. What does and what doesn't. Let's respect what was here in the past, but let's live in the present and look toward the future. And it's really interesting that there was a rebirth of this community. One tiny little example, in the old days, there was one woman on the Chevra Kadisha for the women's Chevra to work on getting people dressed and prepared for burial. We have 13, 14 women now. And the men's group is a large group. The men always had people, but the women didn't want to go anywhere near that. But there's a whole, people are involved, women certainly are involved spiritually in a very different way now. And that's a change in the community. And I think it has to do with who's here, So I think it's very positive and hopeful. We're at a kind of lull again now because we can't afford to have a full-time rabbi, and we have had a couple of different part-time spiritual leaders who are studying to be rabbis. And there's some very good things about that. And the one big drawback is there isn't somebody there all the time, and some things kind of slip through the cracks, and we have to run around trying to take care of them. But by and large, I think we're here to stay, and the changes will happen as they happen. And I guess that's it.
That's great. Thank you.